Twilight of the Gods is an interesting animated series built around real-life Norse mythology over on Netflix, but it makes some very big changes to the mythology within the show. So today we're gonna break it all down, especially the absolutely crazy ending. So spoiler alert, turn back now if you want to see the show without spoilers. Twilight of the Gods was an 8-episode series that ultimately had a very simple story. The protagonist is Sigrid, an original character who is half giant on her father's side and half human on her mother's side. Because of that, she was smaller than everyone else in her kingdom of giants and eventually fell in love with a human named Leaf. After bringing Leaf home to her giant clan for a wedding, however, the Norse god of thunder and storms, Thor, comes to the giant clan seeking Loki, who many of you probably know to be the trickster god of Norse mythology. When the giants insist he isn't there, Thor ends up massacring the entire race of giants, setting up the very dark portrayal of Thor and later his father Odin as bloodthirsty gods of war who ultimately are a negative influence on the world. Sigrid survives this massacre only because Thor's more peaceful brother, the Golden Balder, lies and claims that his power of lightning had killed even all of the children. Sigrid is just half giant, but after the death of her people, Loki convinces her that she can kill Thor herself by using a magical weapon made of god-killing iron. This weapon alone could kill Thor, but to truly get to him, she would also need to turn another group of gods, the Vanir, against Thor and his gods, the Aesir. This leads to the Battle of Ragnarok, the Nordic end times battle, where the family of Thor will fight with the family of Loki, with most of these gods dying in that battle. However, in Twilight of the Gods, Loki is revealed to be trying to change the fate that is given in the real-life Nordic prophecies, as his own daughter was fated to die fighting Thor. In the show, Loki hoped to change this fate by convincing Sigrid to kill Thor using the god-killing iron. These are special weapons that cut through the strings of fate, ending the life of otherwise immortal beings. By being the one to kill Thor, Sigrid would take on the fate of Loki's daughter, allowing her to escape the prophecy of the real-life myths. The show builds towards an epic potential Ragnarok in the finale, but during this, Odin is given a strange vision that stood out to a lot of viewers, as this great vision was of the future showing Jesus Christ and the spread of his religion coming to the people of Europe, the people who were then worshipping Odin. The story, of course, was directed by Zack Snyder, who's known for inserting strong Christian themes into his work, such as we saw with Superman in the Man of Steel movies. In some ways, Twilight of the Gods tries to fit Christianity in with Nordic myth, but in other ways, it seems to go out of its way to twist the similarities the two do have away from each other. Nordic mythology is interesting because the written accounts only date back to the 13th century after the death of Christ, with the extensive writings we today call the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. These were written in a time where Christianity had already spread through much of Europe, and the compiler of these Eddas, Snorri Sturluson, was actually a third generation or so Christian. Because of this, his opinion on the Eddas was very Christian as well, seeing these as important history to his people and culture, but a history that was already being neglected because of Christianity's spread. In fact, these stories would become essentially lost until the 17th century, when a copy of Sturluson's work would surface in a library, leading to a renewed interest in this mythology, some parts of which had been essentially forgotten. The point is that even at the time of their writing, the myths themselves were shown to have obvious Christian influence, and in some cases were seen as a repaganizing of the Christian stories with a strong focus on the end-time prophecies. In the real-life Eddas, Odin is presented as a god who seeks wisdom and knowledge of the future. While he has some various associations with the gift of prophecy himself, he is known for famously giving up one of his eyes in order to see the future, as well as for consulting a seer such as the Sade Kona in the show. In the poem Voluspa, Odin seeks a seer to tell him the fate of him and his children, and she begins to discuss with him the events known as Ragnarok, where many of the gods will meet their demise. This is a time of turmoil for all humans where many of them will turn against each other according to the poem. Already, you can see how this can feel similar to the Book of Revelation, where the end of our world is described as a time of chaos. It is during this battle that both Odin and his son Thor would meet their own ends. Odin is described as going to battle against Loki's child, the wolf Fenrir, who we see in the show, with this battle leading to the death of Odin, the god most revered in the entire Nordic tradition. Odin is avenged by one of his lesser-known sons, Vidar, but Thor's fate is just as grim. Thor, according to the prophet, will fight and even kill the serpent child of Loki, Jormungandr, but the serpent's venom will allow Thor only to walk 9 steps before he falls and dies. Odin is portrayed as sometimes going to great lengths to get this very information, such as giving up his eye in order to see a final vision of his fate, but he is also shown to be accepting of it. In the show, this comes off as Odin and Thor just being tired, wanting to simply see the end of their own sagas, as he says, but in the prophecies, this has a different ending than just the end of the saga. In the Voluspa, where Odin is described as dying alongside his son Thor, the prophet says that following the great battle between Odin and Loki's families, Odin's son Balder will return from the dead and live peacefully in the world that follows with his brother Hoder. Balder is presented in the show as a glowing golden god who seems to want peace more than the rest of his family, the other more violent sons of Odin. Earlier in the poem, the prophet sang about Balder when talking about the many events of the past and the great wars of other myths, teaching the reader that this prophet is well versed in all the different myths and knows how they will all connect together, with Balder having his own myths outside of this one that elaborates on the importance of Balder being slain but then returning. In poems like Balder's Dream and stories like The Beguiling of Gilf, Balder is known to have nightmares that someone is trying to kill him. Because of this, the gods require everything in the world to make a vow not to kill Balder. This makes him essentially invincible, and the gods actually take joy in attacking Balder with the most powerful weapons that they have, showing how he is completely unable to be injured by any material of the world. However, the only thing in the world that did not take this vow was the mistletoe, a seemingly harmless plant. Loki, because he was jealous of Balder's beauty and how beloved he was among the gods, tricks the blind brother of Balder, Hoder, into using the mistletoe dart to kill Balder, who thinks he's just innocently playing the same game as the other gods. This mistletoe weapon kills Balder, however, and this is actually what leads to Loki being imprisoned by the other gods, with a venomous snake hanging over Loki's head, slowly dripping venom onto his face. In this new plan, Sigrid takes on the role of Hoder, which aims to get Thor killed instead of Balder. She is the one who adds the mistletoe to her already god-killing spear, making it a weakness to Balder instead of Thor. Now, in the show, Balder isn't the target of Loki at all, but instead, Thor accuses Balder of orchestrating his death by allowing Sigrid to have survived the massacre while claiming that Thor had killed everyone there. Balder seems to not have wanted this fate and instead was trying to be merciful to Sigrid, but because it had led to someone trying to kill Thor, he tried to protect him. The god-killing iron may not have any effect on Balder considering the story of his blessings, but since it had the mistletoe on it, Balder was able to die in the season finale. The show makes it clear that Sigrid is the new version of Hoder by having them call for Hoder immediately after Balder is hit, with Hoder being the one to explain in the show that it was the mistletoe that was used to kill him, emphasizing the connection between Sigrid in the show and Hoder in the real-life myths. Now, in the show, Odin is given a vision of what is to come from the Sade Kona, including of his own death, but he doesn't see the return of Balder. Instead, he sees the coming of Christ and the worship of Christ among his own people. However, Balder himself is often seen as a parallel to the Christ figure, as well as one of the messianic figures of Judaism with a similar story himself. It probably seems obvious to a lot of people that Balder and Jesus are similar in that they experience a death and a resurrection. Odin is not just a god, but he's called the All-Father, the god of all, with Balder being his precious son, who is beloved by the world and then killed by a traitor among the 12 gods. Jesus, of course, is the beloved Son of God, sent down to earth ultimately to be slain when he's betrayed by one of his 12 disciples, Judas. Odin, interestingly, is presented as something of a self-sacrificing savior figure as well, hanging himself from the world tree for 9 days. This is presented in the show as being very similar to the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross, with Odin seen hanging on the world tree just across from Jesus. The story of Jesus itself is rooted in the earlier Jewish story of Joseph. Joseph is one of the 12 brothers that started the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph, like Balder, had prophetic dreams as well, and in his, he sees his brothers bowing down to him. Because of this, one of his brothers, Judah, which in Hebrew is the same as the Greek Judas, betrays Joseph by convincing his brothers to sell him into slavery. Like Loki in the story of Balder, Judah and Judas are these trickster entities who convince a brother or brothers of the psychic leader of the group to have his life ended or ruined. In the story of Joseph being sold into slavery, he eventually returns after rising to power in Egypt as a whole with his gift of psychic interpretation, paralleling the death and rebirth of the psychic Balder after being killed by Loki. What's really interesting is that the story of Judah betraying Joseph also plays out as an important part of messianic prophecy surrounding the end times, similar to what's described with Balder. Joseph and Judah were the fathers of their two tribes of Israel, which later in the Old Testament were at war with each other. During this time, the king of Judah paid the Assyrians to go after their many enemies, which eventually led to the other tribes of Israel being attacked and then exiled into different nations that the Assyrians had control over. According to the book of Jeremiah, Israel had been exiled to the coasts of the earth, indicating that they had a very far reach, but no specific location was mentioned. Here, Ephraim, the son of Joseph, is mentioned in particular as being a beloved firstborn son, who would one day return, reflecting the story of Joseph being sold into Egypt by Judah, but eventually returning. In the 13th century, the Jewish Zohar would surface, elaborating more on the lost tribes of Israel, particularly the tribe of Joseph, sometimes called Ephraim. In the section Balak, for instance, it refers to the Messiah from the line of Joseph as being a figure that dies near the end times, but then rises from the dead, reflecting how Joseph was sold into slavery, but making him this very Christian dying and reborn figure in this myth. This makes sense within the greater Zohar, as it explains in Shema 46 that the 12 tribes of Israel are in exile primarily with the kingdoms of Edom, which is a term used to refer to the Christian countries in Kabbalistic texts. In Vayachi 36, it also explains that Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh were given those names because Ephraim's name means fruitful and Manasseh means forgetful, and thus in their exile among the now Christian nations, they became a great number of people that had their sins forgotten. To many Christians, their lineage is seen as a mix of their native European ancestors, but also the lost tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who they believe mingled among them now thousands of years ago. They see the Christian movement as a whole as the restoration of God's religion to the greater tribes of Israel. To Christians then, Odin and Thor's death in the older mythologies were seen as prophecies of their religion's demise. Balder's resurrection, on the other hand, represented the people themselves continuing to live on, but in a new, more peaceful form, with a religion that reflected the story of Balder, one of death and rebirth, such as seen with Jesus and Joseph. In Twilight of the Gods, then, you can say that the appearance of Jesus in the vision of Odin is actually the same thing as an appearance of Balder, a vision of Odin's son being reborn, and with Balder not being revived at the end of Season 1, a potential second season could very well explore Balder eventually returning through Jesus, something the show doesn't seem to be afraid to explore considering Jesus' appearance in the show. That being said, the show seems more interested in portraying Odin as a villain who is ignorant of his son's eventual resurrection, simply being an angry, violent man with an angry, violent son who both yearn for their own deaths. In doing this, they portray Loki less as a typical villain as he is in the real-life poetry. In the poems, it is Loki who wants to end the age of the gods, just like in the show, but in the show, he wants to spare his daughter. While he's presented as the conniving figure who first killed Balder before getting arrested in mythology, the show makes a point with the characters like Said Kona to insist that the poets did not record the myths accurately. Instead, in the show, Loki is the one who feels his children are doomed to be killed by the Aesir gods, and it's up to him to find any other way to have them killed so that his serpent daughter doesn't have to die. The idea in the show is that even our real-life mythology is flawed by its perspective, which is true to some degree. Even in this video, we've shown how cultures from opposite sides of a continent can still reference each other within their mythology, with everyone casting their own people as different roles in very similar mythic plays found all over the world. The Norse mythology itself acknowledges this sort of religious development with the wars between the Aesir and the Vanir, which the show uses as its starting point to invert the ideas of the Nordic myths. In the show, the Aesir and the Vanir are presented as two groups that have made a peace arrangement, but that are not truly at peace with each other. Their arrangement has prevented more fighting, but it's seen as benefiting only the Aesir. In Norse mythology itself, the two groups were said to be at war deep in the past before eventually agreeing to a peace treaty that involved giving each other hostages from their own groups. In the show, this is Freya, who has become Odin's wife. Freya is considered an Aesir because of this, but she sees herself as a prisoner who was originally a Vanir. In the show, Freya is a combination of the actual Freya, who is a Vanir in Nordic myth, but also Odin's actual wife Frigga, who in many ways is very similar to Freya. Frigga is sometimes interpreted as being the same character as Freya originally, eventually being separated from Freya of the Vanir when she becomes the wife of Odin in the Aesir. In the Eddas, the Vanir don't seem to hate the Aesir, and Odin is said to learn the power of not just seeing the future, but also influencing it from Freya of the Vanir, with this power being generally a feminine art, but one that males can still learn, such as the Sade Kona explains through her own adoption of the teachings from her mother. To many, the story of the Aesir and the Vanir with their peace treaty was a representation of two different cultures coming together and eventually blending, with Thor worship being similar to the thunder god worship found in the East, and one of the most important gods of the Vanir, Nord, being a god of the ocean, associated with the boating peoples of the West and the North. The story within the show is that the Aesir negotiated for a deal that only benefited them through the war that they had started. The Vanir, meanwhile, are portrayed as decaying gods in the show to represent how they became less important than the Aesir and the culture that followed the two merging. With Loki trying to change the prophecies that he knows exist, the Vanir becomes his best chance of preventing his own children from dying in Ragnarok. Loki's story and the story of the Vanir mirror each other in Twilight of the Gods, both being new perspectives on the original that insist that these characters were treated unfairly in Nordic myth. Loki, however, hopes that the Vanir will die in the battle with the Aesir as well, and ultimately wants the end of the age of petty gods on both sides. For Twilight of the Gods, the real question becomes what will happen in a potential second season, which the show definitely hints at. Twilight of the Gods ended with Thor not quite dead, so Loki killed his own warrior Sigrid in order to send her to Valhalla. There, she finds Thor, which sets up a potential second season where she will continue to try and kill him from a different level of this cosmic existence. Loki seemed certain that this was the best way to ensure that his plan continued, to make sure his daughter would not be sacrificed. This would be something of a new fable that would play out in Season 2, called the Song of Sigrid, according to Thor. And considering that Thor does die in the original myths, it seems certain that this will happen in Twilight of the Gods as well. Season 2 would really more explore just the matter of how, as well as presumably the story of Balder. When Balder was killed, it's hard to say where exactly he went in the show, but it doesn't seem to be Valhalla. While I'm sure Valhalla is more than just what we see when Sigrid first wakes up there, it seems to make a point to show Thor there, who is previously mourning the death of Balder, but no Balder himself. In the original myth, Balder is described as not going to Valhalla since he did not die in battle, but instead, because he died by the mistletoe, he went to Hel. Hel is both a location and a person in Nordic myth as seen in the show, with Hel itself being an afterlife guarded by one of Loki's children, also named Hel. Now, in the show, Loki's child presents Hel as a place where sinful people go, but that isn't the case in the original mythology of the Eddas. While Valhalla is a place that only those who die in battle go, Hel itself is for everyone else, not just thieves and liars, but just those who die of old age or sickness even. This means that it is the location that Balder is sent to when he dies as well. According to the beguiling of Gylf in the prose Edda, Balder was told that he could leave if every single entity, both living and dead, cried for Balder's death. Since Balder was not just beautiful to look at, but also beautiful in the spirit as well, there was only ever one person who held out, a giantess who refused to weep for him. In the Edda itself, however, the people are convinced that the giantess is not real, but instead was just Loki in disguise, refusing to cry so Balder won't return. Now, we didn't see the hands coming to take Balder to Hel like we do with the other characters who are sent there, but we also don't see the Valkyries come to take him to Valhalla, and the fact that Thor is so upset at his death indicates that he was never going to go there. I still believe that this means that Balder will be sent to Hel, but his divine nature made his death look a bit different. Season 2 may reveal that he could be brought back to life as well, and Thor may spend much of the season trying to accomplish that, only to realize it would require Loki himself to cry. Loki, who was caught smiling slyly at this accidental death when it happened. Now, despite Loki or the supposed giantess being responsible for Balder not returning, the myths do say that after the battles of Ragnarok, Balder will return and live in peace in the world alongside his brother Hoder. This would indicate that after the Battle of Ragnarok, Loki will weep for Balder, leading to his resurrection. Right now, the story is becoming more about how badly Loki doesn't want his own child to die, but she seems determined to make sure this happens. By sleeping with Thor, she says it is already fated to happen, and she acts as if she has doubts about her father's plan to spare her this fate. I could see the story building into Jormungandr refusing to give up this destiny, choosing to die to fulfill the prophecies and remove Thor and his father from the world. Perhaps it is only from this happening, from losing his own daughter, that Loki will end up crying a tear for the lost children of the war that he had such a big part in, even for Balder. Someone who only died because someone he sent after Thor ended up killing him instead. In the show, I think we could see Balder not return in his typical Golden Norse form, however, but rather as Jesus himself potentially. With Balder being replaced by Christ in Odin's vision, it would make sense for him to return in some way related to the Christ figure, representing his people adopting this faith in the world to come. I feel like the show is already hinting at this, with Balder and Jesus both wearing very similar outfits in the show, both just having a white cloth around their waist. But for some people, the idea of Jesus Christ in an animated story about Norse gods may be hard to understand. With the Norse religion having its roots before Christianity but not writing down its stories until Christianity had already taken over its culture, it's hard to understand where the original myths end and the paganization of Christian ideas begin. But what do you guys think about Twilight of the Gods, and particularly the way they changed the myths? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you'd like to learn more about mythology through cartoons, consider checking out our video we did on the Netflix series Blood of Zeus. Like Twilight of the Gods, it's a reimagining of European myth, in this case the Greeks, and personally I find it to be a much more tasteful adaptation with a lot of similarities. I will include a link to my recent breakdown of their second season in the pinned comment down below, and check out the playlist we have for big mythological breakdowns of other cartoons as well. See you guys next time!